Antes que empecemos, tengo mi duda, no tengo, pero queremos que dice para subir a la el agua de ahí es como que el agua digo que sí. Let's go now. We want to No, on this side, otherwise. So, do you want to be in the picture? No? You sure? Okay. Okay, say cheers, guys. Okay, thank you so much.
Ya lo presentaron, ¿no? Ya lo presentaron. Okay. So welcome everybody. I'm gonna do the introduction in English because we have visitors. So we are very happy today because we have here with us Juan Herreño. Juan is an assistant professor at UCSD. Juan, you have about 1 hour and a half. And the public is free to intervene whenever they like. And you have some people connected online, so they will also be participating. So the first.
Good. Thanks for having me. So I'm going to be presenting this new paper. We're going to have soon. Titled Inflation in Distorted Economies Evidence from India, and it's joined with Remy, who's at Columbia, and Matt, who's a graduate student at Paris. Good. So the topic of this paper is to ask what we think is a very interesting question, and it is how inflationary are demand expansions in developing economies. And when you think about the inflationary effects of aggregate demand expansions, then you think about the shape of the Phillips curve, both its slope and what shifters it has. Right? And basically, when you care about like this shape of the Phillips curve, what this is going to dictate is how sluggish is the aggregate price level after changes in demand. Okay? And we think this is interesting because, unsurprisingly for a central bank, the shape of the Phillips curve is going to determine things like monetary neutrality, but also the real effects of any aggregate demand shock. Now, when you think about like, well, what is it in the data that we know about the shape of this important object, the Phillips curve, then you discover quite quickly that the vast majority of the empirical estimates of this object come from very developed countries, which are a particular subset of countries. And they focus mostly on its slope, not on what shifts the Phillips curve. Kind of like the wisdom that we have is that at least if you focus pre-COVID, then this object, the Phillips curve, is relatively flat, which means that inflation doesn't move very much after a change that is temporary in aggregate. Okay? And as I said, most of the literature, with the exception of one particular paper, and we're talking about it, focuses on the slope of the Phillips curve and ignores the effects of monetary interventions on this allocation. Okay? We're going to be talking about that very much. But now, the fact that we have estimates about the developed world, but now the developing world is not sufficient to explain why we wrote this paper. But why we think this is interesting is because there are many economic forces that are at play at developing economies that influence the shape of the Phillips curve that we think are substantially different in principle compared to how the economics work in developed countries. Okay.
One quick clarification. When you say aggregate demand expansion, you mean monetary policy shocks, or you mean something else?
What we're going to be talking about is something that only moves the output gap because it moves output. But yeah, you shouldn't. If you want to talk about something like the expansions of like fiscal policy, then you need to make a little bit of an adjustment depending on think wealth effects are. So our framework is going to be like tailored to think about monetary policy shocks, but the adjustments that you need to do if you care about something like expansions in fiscal policy are very small.
Okay. But the thing is that if you care about expansion of fiscal policy, then you need to add another layer in the middle bullet saying monetary policy responsiveness. But if you talk about monetary policy shocks, you can ignore that part.
Exactly. And that, so that's simpler. And so
okay.
So in these developing economies, most of them have persistently steady state inflation rates that are like higher than in developed countries. And if you think that price stickiness is a function of inflation rates, which you sort of do, then you might think that the shape of the Phillips curve is going to be different in developing countries rather than in developed countries. But not only that, but the production technologies that firms in developing countries have, they're also different. They're, for example, less scalable. Juan Herreño will have a fantastic book on core economics in which they have like very extreme examples of how marginal returns increase very rapidly for firms in developed countries. And this shape of the production function is going to influence the determination of marginal costs of these firms. And because we think that the determination of prices depend crucially on the shape of the marginal cost curve, then this is also going to be different. And then there is like a massive literature on macro development that documents that in developing nations, there's severe misallocation of resources that could, in principle, interact with prices and behavior. I'm going to be very clear about what I mean. Now, when you change your economic theory hat or your policymaking hat, then whenever you review the literature and you look into periods in which these developing countries, and I'm going to give you evidence for India, so maybe it's easier to just like use that example. When these countries go through changes in their monetary policy framework or in their targets, there is unequivocally the fact that many critics are going to say that these are not going to work in the developed world because inflation in developing countries works differently. And they're going to say something like, there's fiscal dominance in these countries, so the monetary policy authority cannot even control inflation. Maybe the basket of inflation relies very heavily on things like food prices, so the central bank cannot control inflation and things like that. So we want to contribute a little bit to this discussion. Okay. So what we're going to do is to estimate the Phillips curve in India. We're going to follow what is called in literature a bottom-up approach, which is going to use microdata on input costs and production prices of individual firms. We're going to write a model, and the model here, you should see it as basically dictating the identification of the rest of the paper. It's going to be a 5-equation equation model with variable markups and input wedges. And then inflation, after a temporary expansion in demand, is going to change because of 2 different reasons. Okay? The first reason is the very traditional one, which is through the slope of the Phillips curve, which just means that holding the allocation of production across different firms, an expansion in demand is going to increase inflation. Okay? And some allocative inflation effects, which are going to look like some endogenous shifts of the Phillips curve. Because when demand is expanded in these economies, the allocation of who gets to produce more is going to change. And these different firms are going to like charge higher or lower prices, and that is going to affect inflation. I'm going to be very specific in how this works. What we think is the main contribution of this paper is not going to be this model, but it's going to be this portable method to separately identify the components of the Phillips curve. And we're going to give you a series of resource designs that we're going to apply to India, but that you can use and apply it in different countries. Okay. And the very cool thing about this method is that it is going to be robust to several forms of misspecification of our structural model. So, for example, if we get the shape of preferences wrong, that doesn't matter. If we get about like one specific form in which the supply for inputs works in a different way, that's not going to matter too much. And I'm going to be very clear about that. And crucially, this approach is going to be free of matching IRF steps that the literature has used in the past in order to estimate the slope of the Phillips curve that effectively are using information from other subblocks of the model. For example, let me explain how it works. Sometimes in order for you to estimate the Phillips curve, what many papers do is that they simulate in their model a monetary policy shock. They compute the impulse response of inflation in that month after that monetary policy shock. And then they're going to contrast that input response function in the data with a simulated input response function in the model. And the issue is that in the model, the shape of the input response function of inflation after a monetary policy shock depends not only on the shape of the Phillips curve, but also on the shape of the demand curve and the shape of the monetary policy boost, right? And our approach doesn't depend on that. That's one approach. And as I said, we're going to apply this method to India. So we're going to use a representative sample of manufacturing establishments in India from 1998 to 2017. And we're going to show you that what you need to estimate are basically these two inputs. They're going to be the extent of price rigidity in the data, the pass-through of input costs to input prices, and the slope of marginal cost curves. And we're going to show you how to estimate that. Okay. I think I said it. So the main finding of the paper so far, when I say so far, is because you're going to see that some part of the paper is still in the works, is that the Phillips curve in India is steep. What we mean by that is that the slope of the Phillips curve in India is something like 8 times higher, almost 1 order of magnitude higher. And the best estimates that we have here are using the US for the slope of the Phillips curve for the US, but also for other developed countries like Belgium. Okay. And the very nice thing about our approach is that you can decompose where this difference is coming from. Okay.
What is the clarification? Yes. The US is based on your estimate is based using the same methodology to the US, or like your paper with Nakamura stage or something like that?
Yeah, so it's going to be very similar if you use something like this, the paper that we wrote with Joe and John for the US, which uses a different approach. It's going to be important. I'm going to talk about that. But also it's going to be something like almost the same ratio if you compare it with a method that uses also firm level data in Belgium. Okay. Now, where our number comes from, the research designs are going to be slightly different than those in Belgium, and I'm going to be clear on that. But this also applies when you try to estimate the Phillips curve with firm level data. Okay. Now we're using the US as shorthand. This should be like a developed countries.
So suppose that the distribution, the frequency of price changes is the same for the US and India, but I mean, not the same, the average frequency of price changes is the same, but one distribution is more concentrated than the other. There is less cross-sectional variation. In which of the variation? In price stickiness.
Okay, we're not going to have that. So I cannot tell you that, but tell me more.
The cross-sectional distributions across countries may be something that naturally could vary, and so I'm wondering how that is going to be pinned down here. It's going to be in the frequency. It's going to be on what?
Yeah. So in the model that I'm going to present today, in the results that I'm going to present today, is going to show up nowhere. I'm going to show you evidence that the price rigidity doesn't change much. That's like some estimates that we have. And we have an extension of the model in which we have heterogeneity in price rigidity. And what comes from that is that the statistic that we should measure, but this is relies on us using a Galois model. That what you need is something like the weighted average frequency of price changes. That is what's going to enter in the slope of the Phillips curve. Now, for the second part of the paper, which is to understand how these reallocative effects of monetary policy work, then if you have differences in price rigidity, that is going to be important. Yes.
Can you tell us maybe this is my intuition. In India, the prices are like not intervened; they are not fixed. How is the economy in terms of?
Yeah. So the results, there is like a fraction of economic activity in India, in particular the price of some key inputs that are going to be regulated. Okay? Now, our results look very similar if we use or exclude the fraction of firms that produce those products that are regulated. So we don't think it is a huge issue, but in the data it is important. And in particular, in some of this time period, there were, like around 2002, if I'm not wrong, a series of reforms that deregulated many of these prices. Yeah, but they're not a very big issue of what we're doing.
This is just manufacturing, right? So
Yes.
when you convert it to Philips curve in the US, it's also just manufacturing.
That is important. So, I mean, for the Indian firms, yes. For the Belgian firms, yes.
Okay.
For the US, no. For the US, the slope of the Philips curve is going to be very different. It is going to be the Philips curve of the non-tradable sector. So of course, you know, in the way that I see this is that each of these estimates that are in the literature have like some issues of external validity in one way. And you know, the empirical economist in me is very reluctant to talk about like how that external validity problem was not an issue. So yeah, literally how you should interpret our results is that is the Philips curve for the manufacturing sector. And
So is it big in India, or because I mean, from guess would be that like the informal sector is very important in India, and service is also very important.
yes, and so exactly. So this is going to be data not only for the manufacturing sector, but for the formal manufacturing sector. It is still an important sector of the economy. Now, how this slope of the Philips curve looks for the informal sector, we have no idea, but that is something important to do. Yes, absolutely.
And you check it, how it does with the I don't know, with CPI or something.
I'll show you that. I'll show you that. Yeah. I'll show you that. Okay, so one of the cool things of this mechanism of starting with firm level data is that we can decompose why this number is high. And as I told you, you should go through 3 steps. One is like, what is the frequency of price changes in this economy? How much strategic complementarities in price setting there are such that the pass-throughs of marginal cost into prices change? And what is the slope of marginal cost after changes in quantities? I'm going to explain all those in detail. The important thing is that the first channel is going to explain something like 25% of the difference. The second channel explains nothing. And the lion's share of the difference of the slope of the Philips curve in India and in other latitudes, according to our estimates, comes from the fact that the slope of marginal cost in India, which is going to reflect something like the extent of decreasing return to scale, but also the market for inputs, is going to be way more inelastic than for other firms. Okay, so I'll show you that. Yes.
I don't know if you mentioned, but when you measure this marginal cost curves, are you including both the input side, but also like the factor for like labor and things like?
Yes.
How's that?
So in our main model, we're going to have materials and we're going to have labor. This forms a bundle using a constant return to scale production function. And then these variable inputs are going to have decreasing return to scale in production.
You measure both in the data, right? You have.
We are going to measure both in the data. Yeah, but let me get back to that because there is like an important subtlety. Going back to your question, there is a question that even if we can estimate the slope of the Philips curve, it could be that once we aggregated the slope of the Philips curve and feed it in through some measure of economic activity at the aggregate level, it could be that is very bad at explaining aggregate inflation. Okay, so we are going to show you that it actually, once you measure a measure of the output gap that is independent from that we're not using in our estimation at all, then you use the slope of the Philips curve that we estimate, then our estimates rationalize actually quite well aggregate inflation dynamics for the manufacturing sector. I'll show you. That's like a great question to ask because this is going to basically answer the question of whether local aggregate demand is important for determining aggregate local prices. And the answer is yes. Okay, and then what we do in the paper is to show you how these allocative effects of policy work. So what I'm going to show you today is some key statistics on how we.
So maybe I didn't understand well in the motivation, but I thought that you were going to do also something to study whether the slope of the Philips curve changed before and after the COVID.
No, we're not going to do that.
So nice.
Yeah, we're not going to do that. Perhaps we should, but so far we haven't. We haven't done that.
Well, I'm sorry, this to be sure, in the allocative efficiency, you're going to study like the misallocation effects of inputs due to distorted relative prices, or like thinking about this paper by Bakay.
Yeah.
Party.
Yeah. So maybe this is a good moment I should speak the literature. So let me talk about it. So What is it that I talk about this? Here.
Yeah.
So in the the basic inflation model, these economies are inefficient because of the presence of the fact that individual firms receive a demand curve that is downward sloping. And so they're going to price at marginal cost plus a markup that in the textbook inflation model is going to be a fixed markup, right? That is going to drive an inefficiency. That you can cure that inefficiency with a very simple subsidy, like for example, labor subsidy. Now in this paper, just like this Bakari-Farizangani paper, then there is the issue that in steady state, different firms are going to charge different markups. So that is going to give you not only an aggregate efficiency, but inefficiency in the cross section, which is the fact that similar firms that are going to face similar marginal costs are going to charge different prices. From the perspective of the planner, that is not going to be efficient. Now they do this in a model in which you don't have any inefficiencies in the input side. It's all inefficiency arising from markups, and you're going to have constant return to scale. So you could see our model as their model, but with decreasing return to scale in input wages. And I'm going to show you that some of the statistics that they, in this paper, in this kind of economy in which you only have markup dispersion, you need to compute, are actually not the ones that in our economy you need to compute something slightly different. To give you the anticipation, in here, in their model, you need to compute something like pass-throughs across the size distribution. In our model, you need to compute something like heterogeneous pass-throughs across the TFPI distribution. But I'm going to show you all that in detail. Okay. Good. Perfect. Let me show you the model. So as I said, this is going to be a generally curved model with heterogeneous firms. These firms are going to face calculable frictions in the model, in the version that I'm going to show you today. The frequency of price changes that every firm in this economy is going to face is the same. And these firms are going to have variable desired markups even in the flexible price allocation. Okay? That is literally their model. Okay? What we're going to have is that we want to capture that in this sort of what we're going to call distorted economies. These firms are going to have arbitrary degrees of return to scale to capture this idea that just the technologies that firms in the developing world have are less scalable, perhaps. And we're going to have input wages to capture the notion that the macro development literature has documented that different firms pay different prices for the same inputs. Okay, so we're going to capture that. The model is going to give us a slope of the Phillips curve, which is going to depend on three components: the extent of price rigidity, the extent of strategic complementarities at the micro level, and the degrees of return to scale. And we're going to show you how to measure that. And then the model is going to tell you that you need to compute what is the effect of monetary policy shocks on allocative efficiency. And then we're going to show you that you not only need the covariance of the pass-through across different firms with demand elasticities, which in a model like ours or theirs is going to be a covariance of pass-throughs with respect to size, but also a covariance of pass-throughs with respect to allocative distortion. Okay? So the model is quite simple. There is a representative consumer. This representative consumer has standard preferences over consumption and leisure. And they're going to maximize their utility, their lifetime utility, subject to a series of budget constraints in which the household can either spend on consumption goods or buy bonds. And their sources of income are going to be their financial wealth, the labor income, and a set of transfers that are going to compute both government transfers, but importantly, the profits of the firm. The only difference from the textbook model is that instead of this household consuming this bundle using a CES function, then this is going to be an arbitrary Kimball aggregator for which we don't need, for anything that I'm going to show you today, we need to specify what is the specific shape of that Kimball demand, as long as it's Kimball. Okay, that we need. This Kimball demand is going to give us relative demand function for a particular firm, in which relative demand that the consumer demands of variety I is going to be given by basically the curvature of the Kimball aggregator as a function of a single relative price. Something that is very important is that we can compute from this Kimball aggregator what is the price elasticity of demand, which is a partial equilibrium object that is going to tell you what is the elasticity of quantities when the price of that given variety changes. And the important thing is that as opposed to CES, this is going to be a function as not a number. Now, I squeeze something by you, so I want to fix it. This price index, PTY, is in theory different from the substitution price, PT. This is not unique to us. This is characteristic of Kimball demand. This PTY is going to be the ideal price index. It's going to be the price index that makes that total consumption expenditures are equal to the aggregation of firm level expenditures. That is the definition of the ideal price index. And this squiggly P is going to be the relevant price for substitution when it comes to demand. It's going to be equal to the Lagrange multiplier of the cost minimization of the firm. The difference between these two price indexes is going to be this demand index that is going to capture what is the average curvature of preferences across different firms. Okay? In the case of CES, this is a number, and these two price indices coincide, but that is a special case of CS, okay? Because CS is a special case of schema. Now, the interesting action in this model is going to come on the firms that produce these intermediate varieties. Okay? These firms are going to face causal frictions. They can reset their prices with probabilities 1 minus alpha. They're going to produce using a production function that depends on their productivity, which is permanent, and a decreasing return to scale function on variable inputs, where variable inputs are going to be a constant return to scale function that is going to combine labor and materials. We have an extension in which we have that. These firms are going to face some input wedges on materials. So that means that different firms have to pay different prices on the materials that they buy. And on top of that, in order to map to the empirics, this is not important for the economics, but it is going to be important when we show you the identification strategies in the data. These firms are also going to receive idiosyncratic shocks to the cost of materials that they need to pay. Once you combine number 2, 3, and 4, what you get out of that is a marginal cost curve for a particular firm that is upward sloping with respect to. In the case of constant return to scale, of course, A is equal to 1, and this number disappears. Then the marginal cost curve for an individual firm is going to be completely horizontal. Okay? That is not the case here. They're going to face an upward sloping marginal cost curve. Okay, so the equilibrium is going to be very standard. Consumers are going to choose consumption and labor in order to maximize their utility, taking prices as given. Firms with flexible prices set their prices in order to maximize the value of their firms. They're going to satisfy demand, and then firms with sticky prices are committed to satisfy demand at fixed prices. Monetary policy sets a nominal rate, and all resource constraints are satisfied. And then we're going to look linearize this economy in order to be able to give you analytical results. The steady state is going to have zero inflation. I'm going to address that in a second. Importantly, there are going to be no monetary shocks and no cost push shocks in the steady state. And the steady state distribution of firms is going to depend on firm level productivity and firm level input wedges. Now we show in the paper results that, like, when you solve this model in the numerically with inflation in steady state that is not zero, all our results are. And then we're going to do a perturbation in which we introduce a monetary policy shock. Just one additional piece of notation. You're going to see that some lambdas are going to pop up. Lambda IT is only the sales share of firm I with respect to the aggregate. And when you see an expectation lambda of a variable X, what we mean by that is that this is going to be the cross-sectional average of variable X using sales shares as weights. Good. Good. So this is the problem of the firm. The firm wants to maximize its value, which just means that it's going to maximize the stream of profits that it's going to perceive given the price that it's going to fix, taking into account that that price might be fixed for quite some time, which is why this alpha is going to show up. And they're going to discount the profits that they're going to generate using the stochastic discount factor. And these firms are going to maximize this value, taking as given the demand curves that are going to come from the Kimball demand and the structure of the cost function that is going to depend on the production function that they have. When you solve,
Maybe I'm speculating too much, but I was expecting that for allocation efficiency, the key statistic would be the correlation between price stickiness and productivity and TFPR or TFPT. But here the price stickiness is fixed. I mean, it's the same for everyone.
yes, so in this model, you're still going to have reallocative effects of monetary policy, even if everybody has the same level of price stickiness. Now, the question is, in a model in which you have heterogeneity in price stickiness, then what is going to be important? And there is going to be I'm going to show you results that here you care about the covariance between the flexible price pass-through.
Correct.
And something else,
Right.
the allocative efficiency.
Yes.
In the model in which you have heterogeneity in price rigidity, you're going to care about the heterogeneity of the pass-through in the sticky price economy.
Right.
Which is going to combine the pass-through in the flexible price equilibrium and also heterogeneity in price rigidity. That is a chance that is not going to be here. We have it like in the extension.
Okay. So the action is going to come through marginal cost.
And pass-throughs.
For the pass-through. No,
Yes.
but what is the determinant of the pass-through? Is the stickiness of the marginal cost?
No, it is going to be the fact that in the steady state, in the flexible price equilibrium, different firms have different productivity.
Yeah.
So they're going to have different sizes.
Right.
And because this demand curve is non-isoelastic, then different firms are going to perceive different elasticities of demand. And that is going to make them charge different markups, even in the absence of price rigidity.
Got it.
That is how it works. So let me show you. This is exactly what I'm going to show now. When you characterize the decision of this firm, the outcome of this firm's problem is to fix a price, which we're gonna denote by P nu of a firm that in period T of a firm that reset its price in period T. And this is going to be the present value of basically the weighted average of the price that this firm would like to have set in the flexible price equilibrium. And of course, prices by definition are just marginal costs times markups. So in log terms, it's going to be just the sum of the deviation of the markup and the deviation of the markup. The markup here is going to be the markup in the flexible price equilibrium, which is just the Lerner index using the demand elasticity that this firm is going to face in the flexible price equilibrium. One statistic that is very important is that when there is a shock, how much this markup is going to change. Okay? That is going to be given by the markup elasticity, which is nothing else, by definition, that the elasticity of the markup with respect to relative quantities. So let me give you the intuition of how that works. So a firm is going to receive a shock. Okay? If that firm changes its price, then because this firm is going to face a non-isoelastic demand curve, that is going to change their quantities. Well, by how much? By the elasticity of the demand curve and the change in price. Okay. How much the markup is going to change? Well, this is the change in quantities that the firm is going to perceive. And the markup is going to change by that times the markup elasticity. Okay. The important thing is that then you can relabel this equation that has two endogenous variables, changes in markups and changes in marginal costs, into one single equation and into one equation that depends only on the elasticity of the marginal cost, but accounting by this fixed point in which changes in prices feed up into changes in markups and changes in markups feed up into changes in prices. So you can express the reset price of this firm, the elasticity of the reset price of this firm with respect to changes in marginal cost, as coming from this combination of key elasticities, which is what we're going to call theta and we're going to call rho. Let me tell you first what rho is. Rho is nothing else than the flexible price pass-through. If you have an exogenous change of 1% in your marginal cost, by how much you change your price, that is what rho is. Okay. Now, under decreasing returns to scale, once you change your price because your costs change, you're going to change its quantity because of your demand curve. And your changes in your quantity are going to change your marginal cost. So Zeta is going to take care of this fixed point between marginal costs and changes in quantities. Okay? In the case of constant return to scale, of course, this fixed point is not operative. So A is going to be equal to 1, and Zeta is just going to be equal to 1. Okay? You don't have to care about that. Very good. You can write the Phillips curve by aggregating the decision of individual firms. And you can find out that the elasticity of inflation with respect to real marginal costs is going to depend on two different mechanisms for now. One of them is going to be the standard Calvo parameter, which is going to combine how forward-looking firms are and the frequency of price changes. And then the expected pass-through of a change in marginal costs, which is going to aggregate across different firms. These firms in steady state have different sizes, so you have to account. Yes.
And this is the object that you're saying that will explain in the data most of the difference between.
No, the one that I'm gonna tell you that explains most of the data.
The one that comes now.
So
Yes.
that final
This can-
has an aggregate marginal cost.
Yes.
no?
Yes.
Okay, so and you can also separate this expectation in the covariance term, I think. Is there a relationship between this zeta and rho I?
Zeta between zeta and rho. Yes, zeta depends on rho.
Okay, so it's negative. There's a correlation.
There is a correlation there, and that is going to be important. Let me give me a couple of seconds. But yes, very good. One last thing before I show you your question is that you're going to find that there is a shifter that appears here. This shifter, which is going to be dt is the difference between this ideal price index and the substitution relevant price index. This is going to appear in here, basically because when you have changes in marginal costs that trigger reallocation, the curvature of the demand curve is going to change, and you need to account for that. I'm going to tell you more about that in a second. Okay. So here comes the last piece of the puzzle, and I promise to stop bothering you with that. In order to write the Phillips curve, you always, even in the textbook New Keynesian model, you go through one step in which you replace real marginal costs with quantities. Okay. In this model, you also need to do the same thing. It's not different than that. The idea is because there is an upward sloping aggregate supply for inputs, then aggregate marginal costs are going to depend on aggregate quantities and also on aggregate TFP. In the standard New Keynesian model, aggregate TFP is in the flexible price equilibrium is exogenous. So this theta T tilde is 0 always. Now, the important thing here is that this omega coefficient, which is going to be the elasticity of real marginal costs with respect to GDP, is going to depend on a combination of parameters. Okay, a combination of parameters that is going to capture the elasticity of the firm level elasticity of marginal costs, but also the elasticity of the supply for inputs after changing components. In the standard model, this is something like the Frisch elasticity of labor supply. What I'm going to show you is that if you can compute omega, which I'm going to show you a research design in order to do so, you don't need to care about independently what these numbers are. And the stand of the literature so far is that when you go through a step like this to estimate the Phillips curve using term level data, you need to calibrate all these parameters independently and then pray to the people outside that you specify your model correctly. But if you can measure omega is a sufficient statistic for the elasticity of marginal cost with respect to quantities, you don't care what goes inside. Okay.
Well,
Yes.
just a quick question. The last term,
Yep.
on top of the shock,
So-
is it the aggregate of the traffic shock?
Exactly.
Just
This
the
is
sum?
This is an aggregate cost push shock, and this is going to be the change in aggregate TFP after a change in quantities, which because this economy is inefficient, aggregate TFP is going to change after a change in aggregate quantities.
But the cost per shock,
Yeah.
does it collapse to the sum of the?
This is going to be the weighted average using sales shares of the marginal. Yeah. And here we just have it for components. You can- Cool. So this is the New Keynesian Phillips curve in our model. It's going to tell you that inflation, when quantities change, you need to account for three different economic concepts. One of them is price rigidity, then what the New Keynesian literature calls micro-strategic complementarities, which is even in the flexible price equilibrium, how much firms want to change the relative price when demand changes. And the third one is going to be the elasticity of the marginal cost curve with respect to other materials. Right? These are three distinct economic forces. And so you could, in principle, which is what we're going to do, is to estimate them separately. Now, these two shifters that I told you about are this DT shifter, which is the change in the curvature of the demand curve, and also the change in TFP that I'm going to elaborate a little bit. So this is the intuition about these obscure objects that I know are obscure so far, D and C.
So I don't know how important it's going to be later, so I don't want to make a big deal out of this, but the point I made before is that the phi that is on the if it's the heterogeneous two, it's going to be inside the
Exactly. And so for now, if you maintain the Calvo assumption, this is maybe I can use the word. I can give you the intuition of why it's not important for this, but just for the other. So you're gonna have something like lambda by I, beta I, rho I, right? Now, if you maintain the Calvo assumption, here's where Calvo is really important, is that the realization of the Calvo ferry is going to be independent with respect to your steady state pass-through. That is the result. And so what you end up doing what you end up being able to do after like a lot of math that I want to bother you with is that you can rewrite this elasticity this way. But here Calvo is very important.
Okay, I'm
curious. But we can talk more about that.
Yeah.
Very good. So this is some characterization of what this D and Z are. Okay, so you can write D as basically depending on the covariance of price changes with demand elasticities in the steady state. Now, changes in prices are of course endogenous variables. Okay? Instead, the change in productivity, you can write it as depending on, basically first let me introduce this object, which is the aggregate state level, steady state distortion. Okay, so this economy is inefficient, as I said in the introduction, because firms charge different markups and because firms face different input wages. Okay. From the perspective of the aggregate in steady state, the steady state distortion that this economy is going to perceive is going to be basically the geometric average of the individual combined distortion that firms are going to have, weighted by the fact that different firms have different sizes in steady state. In the special case in which you don't have input distortions, then total TFP is going to be just a linear transformation of the changes in demand. This is intuitive. The only distortion that the economy is going to face is demand. Therefore, TFP distortions are only going to be a linear transformation of demand distortions. In the general case, that is not going to be the case. CT is still going to depend on the extent of demand distortions, but also is going to depend on how TFPR moves with the prices that firms are going to set. Okay. The difference from the perspective of allocative distortions with respect to this, for example, this Bakai Fares Sangani that I'm reading because some of you asked about it, is that this is not going to be equal to 0 in the model tools. Very good. You can write laws of motion because these changes in prices are going to have a second order difference equation. So you can input those here and write these two economic objects, DT and CT, which are going to be shifters in the Phillips curve as a second order difference equation.
It's not true because you have the wages at the firm.
Yes.
Can come up with it. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so this is the 5-equation New-Keynesian model. All I'm going to be saying is how this object behaves, the slope of the Phillips curve, but I'm going to need number 2 and number 3 because they fit into it. And then you close the model with an Euler equation and a monetary policy rule, but I'm not even going to take a stance on that. This is just to show you that that the model is correctly closed. So when you have constant return to scale and no input wedges, then the covariance at the end between pass-throughs and demand elasticities is going to be sufficient for TFP. Now, when you depart from that, this is not going to be true for 2 reasons. Just moving to non-constant return to scale is going to mean that you not only care about rho, but you care about the effect of changes in quantities and changes in marginal cost. And because this is the question that was asked before, because zeta E has a rho I in the denominator, then the sign of this covariance can just change in sign with respect to the constant return to scale parameter when you have decreasing return to scale. So in a model with sufficient amount of decreasing return to scale, after an increase in demand, you can have decreases in TFP, even if in the model with constant return to scale, you have increases in TFP. Okay, so the sign of the effect on the demand distortions can just change by the effect that you have decreasing return to scale. Now, if on top of that, you put input wedges, which we think that for this class of economies is important, then you not only have to keep track of this object, but you also have to keep track of the covariance between the input wedges and pass-throughs. Okay? Intuitively, you need to keep track about the covariance between TFPIs and pass-throughs. Very good. Okay. How much time do you have?
Almost 40. Yeah, a little bit more than 40.
Okay, great. Okay, so done with math, I think, almost. Okay, so here I'm going to show you some motivating plots for the application. Okay, so this is data for India. In the x-axis, we have a measure of the output gap for the manufacturing sector. And what we're going to use is the Hamilton filter. Okay, the Hamilton filter, what it does is basically a method that builds transitory changes on the idea of forecast errors. It's going to regress output on lagged values of output, and it's going to compute the difference between the actual realization of output and the fitted value as a transitory shock of output. Okay? And on the y-axis, we're going to have annual inflation in the manufacturing sector in India. I'm using the manufacturing sector because that's what we have the micro data for. Each dot is a quarter. So I want to call your attention about 2 sub-episodes of monetary history in India. The first episode comes after the Great Financial Crisis. After the Great Financial Crisis, India had imposed a bunch of expansionary policies. The output gap was massively positive. But then the government decided to retrench. And while it did it, the Indian economy entered into quite a big recession. But curiously, inflation didn't fall. Now, you would be tempted to extrapolate from this plot and conclude that the slope of the Phillips curve in India is very flat. Output moves a lot, and inflation doesn't change. Of course, at the same time, when you read economic history in India, you realize that during this period, India received a sequence of very negative input shocks that all else equal should have been quite inflationary.
Why output gap is detrended? It shouldn't be output related to frictionless output?
Yes, exactly. And so here, because that is non-measurable, we're using this trend as a measure of the flexible price output. That is basically what we're doing. Okay? Now, this is only for motivation.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, we're not going to use any measure of output gap.
Okay.
For our incident. Okay, now if you move forward in time only a couple of years ago, you enter into the period after Rajan was the chairman of the Reserve Bank of India. And as the US did in the 80s, the central bank in India changed its monetary policy framework into something that looks very close to inflation target. A couple of years later, inflation in India plummets and the output gap doesn't change. Now, you could argue from this that the slope of the Phillips curve is perfectly vertical in India in this period of time. Now, of course, you can make the argument that the structure of the Indian economy changed in such a way that the slope of the Phillips curve changed from completely flat to completely vertical in 2 years. Okay. A more plausible interpretation, we think, is that you cannot learn anything about the slope of the Phillips curve from this plot, because the size of shocks that are unobservable and difficult to control for make it very difficult to make a stance about the shape of the supply curve from just a correlation between equilibrium output and quantities. Okay, so that's why you shouldn't do this. Okay, you should use something that is a little bit more refined, and we think that we have something better. Perfect. So this is the slope of the Phillips curve that I showed in the model. It said that how I wrote it, this alpha was over here, was over alpha, and we call this bar phi. And so what we're going to show you is that you can estimate this object in 3 simple steps. First, you can estimate alpha. Then you can estimate this full object, which is going to combine estimates of the frequency of price changes and flexible price pass-throughs. And then you can estimate the slope of the cost curve that Indian firms in the aggregate face, which is very similar, for those of you who are familiar, to the very classic Galli-Gerler decomposition that holds in a wide class of Nipecian models, but we're going to do that in the cross-section. Okay? And the important thing is that we're going to do that without relying on the structure of the rest of the model. We're just going to estimate literally these objects. We hope to convince you that that's what we're going to do. Okay, so let me do that. So the data that we're going to use is going to be the ASI, for those of you who have worked with Indian data in the past. It is a representative sample of manufacturing establishments in India, and we're going to use data from 98 to 2017. Crucially, for this discussion that we have, this is going to be manufacturing establishments. This is what we have data for. And we have manufacturing establishment in the organized sector, which means formal firms, that either have more than 20 employees or have more than 10 employees, but use electricity as an input. That is what the data is going to capture. Now, in a paper about inflation, you really need data on prices. And so the cool thing of the ASI is that at the product level, we're going to observe for each product that the firm sells, we're going to have information on the quantities that they sell and their unit values. We're going to observe that for over 1,000 distinct 5-digit products that Indian manufacturing firms sell. And because of that, we can compute indices at the firm product time level of changes in prices and changes in quantities that these firms are going to sell and the prices that they're going to charge. And whenever we need to, you can aggregate these changes in prices across different products by using a Turnkey's index. Okay. Now, on the side of inputs, the data is quite similar. We're going to observe the inputs on quantities and unit values that Indian firms buy. We're going to have data for over 1,000 distinct materials, plus 3 categories of energy and labor. And that means that we can compute at the firm product level changes in the quantity of inputs that these firms are going to use and changes in the price of inputs that these firms are going to pay. And whenever we need to, you can aggregate these changes in material prices using similar Turnkey's index. Great. So this is the probability of price changes per year in the manufacturing establishments from this data. This is the weaker part of evidence. So we're doing the paper quite a little bit of work. Okay. So what we have here in the y-axis is the frequency of price changes for the aggregate economy using sales shares as weights, which is what our model asks for. You're going to see that this is at the annual level. You're going to see that our mean estimate is something like 91%. It means that if firms adjust their prices, 91% of them adjust their prices at an annual frequency. That means that roughly half of them adjust quarterly, or 18% adjust monthly.
This is not manufacturing.
This is manufacturing.
This is manufacturing.
Yes. Now, when I say that this is the weakest part of the evidence that we have, is because we observe this at the annual level. We would love to have this information at higher frequency. So here we measure this at the annual level and literally use the assumption of the model that we're using, which is the Calvo model, in which these probabilities of price adjustment are IID, in order to infer that the frequency of price changes, for example, at the quarterly level is 45%. Okay.
So how do you measure the frequency? How do you measure a price? What is a price here in the data?
A price in the data is going to be the unit value for a specific product that a firm sells.
And a product is one of the categories.
A product is going to be a 5-digit product. We've played with that. We've done it like not at the 5, but at the 6-digit, at the 7-digit level. Yeah.
This is aggregated to the firm and then.
This is aggregated to the firm. Yes. No, this is at the product level, and then we aggregate different products at the firm level, and we aggregate different firms. Now, here, the potential for measurement error is important. Okay? So one thing that we do in the paper is to compare how this frequency of price changes compares with the realization of inflation in the manufacturing sector. And what we show is that the frequency of price changes can move significantly with inflation rate. Now, of course, when you think about it for 2 seconds, you realize that this is a violation of the Calvo model, which is something that we're not going to address, at least in the analytical results of the paper. Okay, so we have a numerical method in which we do.
I'm actually a bit worried that in retail,
Yeah.
price is a well-defined object.
Yes. Yes.
And even that is a little bit difficult because there are sales and whatever, and coupons or whatever.
Yes.
But in manufacturing, it's even harder to identify the posted price or something like the posted price. Even if you can identify well a product, there could be different prices for different volumes sold and different clients and whatever.
I agree about that.
So it's not overestimating a little bit the flexibility of prices.
It could be. It could be that we're overestimating how flexible prices are. Now, this particular channel is not going to end up being too important for our results, but you're qualitatively correct. So we do a couple of things. We do what we can do. The first one is to compare how the frequency of price changes for the products that these firms sell compares with the frequency of price changes of the inputs that they buy. Okay, and we see that they're like quite similar. If anything, prices of inputs are a little bit more sticky.
Right.
And then we do something like what is the frequency of price changes if we compare across firms that receive different sizes of input shocks. And we see that unless, of course, you exclude firms that receive 0 input changes, this is quite flat. Okay? And then we do something else in the paper, which is to exclude price changes that are smaller than a threshold and move the threshold. And the numbers are very consistent.
Correct.
But qualitatively, you're correct. You're correct.
How do you, maybe you're going to share later, feel free to differ. How do you identify the input shocks, the input price shocks?
Oh, no, these are just like from the perspective of the firm, these are just changes in the prices of inputs that they pay for this. Like later on, I'm going to give you an instrument, which is going to be very important. I'm going to show you that. Okay, but like to give you like a flavor, this number is very similar to what Gagnon estimates for Mexico when Mexico had a steady state inflation rate that is similar to India, what Nakamura and Sonnebier estimate for the US when the US had a steady state inflation similar to India, and the same exercise for Argentina here, when those countries have the similar. So this is like
Similar in Chile as well.
Hmm?
Similar number in Chile as well.
interesting. What? Yes.
When you, I don't know if you do any sort of cleaning of the data in terms of frequency that you see the data or the transactions or the selling price of a firm in the manufacturing sector, because if I'm not familiar with the manufacturing sector, so maybe it's wrong what I'm going to say, but my guess is that in some industries in the manufacturing sector, you are going to see a firm selling a product every 2 months, maybe. I don't know. Differently for instance, in the retail sector, that you are going to see a lot of transactions within a day. So I don't know how the data in the manufacturing sector is in terms of
So this is,
frequency.
what I would say is that this is not an issue here for the wrong reasons, which is that we observe annual data.
Okay.
And so this panel of products, it does change, change the portfolio of products that we sell. And so in one of these plots that I didn't talk very much, one thing that we do is also to measure the frequency of price changes, not when you compare year by year, forcing that the panel is balanced year by year, but when you compare this year to the next 2 years, and they're consistent. But I just don't want to like give the impression that more high frequency identification would not be better. It would, we would love to have this at the market level, and we just don't. Okay, so the next thing is this coefficient on pass-throughs. So in the model, you can simulate how this literally works. So let me denote by this dummy variable, indicator variable ITP, whether the Calvo ferry hits from I in period T. Of course, this is just an identity that the change in the price that the firm is gonna charge is gonna be equal to the change in the reset price if you get the Calvo ferry hit, and it's going to be to your last period change if you did it. If you plug that formula, this one, on the reset price formula that I showed you when we were characterizing the model, then you can show that the elasticity of firm level prices with respect to idiosyncratic input cost shocks is going to be this number 1 minus beta alpha theta rho. We show in the paper, but it's very immediate to see it from there. If you estimate an IV regression in the model of changes in prices on changes in input quantities instrumented by the changes in input cost, you recover exactly the second input into the Phillips curve. Importantly, to your question, Michael, whether we needed to take a stance on the coefficient of materials in the production function, the answer is that you don't, because that gets differenced out in the first stage of this IV regression. If instead of using an IV regression, you were to regress delta PIT on the shock directly, then you would have an additional term in here, which would be the share of materials in the production function. And so you can avoid measuring that object that doesn't enter into the Phillips curve by running an IV regression as opposed to a reduced form. That's okay. So we're going to estimate this in the data. Okay. Now, how we do that is we run a regression of changes in prices of a particular firm, of a particular product, using product time fixed effects and changes in input costs that this firm is going to pay. Now, the main identification concern comes from the presence of potentially input-specific, firm-specific input prices. So imagine that this firm receives not a cost shock, but it receives a demand shock. Okay? That demand shock goes in here. The demand shock is going to give incentives for the firm to increase its price and increase its quantity. Okay? If the price of inputs that the firm needs to pay depend positively on its quantity, that means that this number is also going to increase. And so you're going to drive variation between input prices and product prices that are not driven by a pass-through of cost shocks into prices, but by the effect of demand shocks on both. That's why you need an instrument.
So this is just input, right? You don't have any labor in here, right?
You don't want labor.
Given that your data is annual data,
Yeah.
you could also imagine that labor is going to be a variable input, right?
It is, in our model, it is. But I guess a way of saying that is that we need to identify a change in the cost of inputs that is not correlated with change in the demand for labor. So that's another reason why you need an instrument as well. Yeah. So in this model, you do have labor. You do have, which is going to be, we would have to go back. But like when you write the model, this model tells you that prices depend on marginal costs, and that marginal cost is going to depend on the price for labor as well. Yeah. Okay, so how we're going to address this identification concern is by using a shifter design, which is going to exploit changes in the price of materials and fuels, which is going to be the shifter, and variation across firms in the same industry in the usage of different materials and fuels. Okay. So the intuition here is, for example, imagine that there is a shock of oil where two firms in the same industry. It just happens that in the pre-period, you use more oil than me. So that is going to increase your marginal cost with respect to mine, and you're going to increase your price with respect to me. That is the assumption. And we do that using both the price for materials and fuels and also the price of only fuels, which are presumably more homogeneous across firms. Okay, this is the result of the estimation. So I'm only going to talk about the IV because of time, but so the elasticity that we measure is this elasticity of 0.22. This means that a 1% shock in input prices makes these firms at an annual frequency to increase their prices by 22%. Now, this is substantially higher than what you get from OLS, which means that the pass-through of demand shocks, not of input shocks, due to the presence of upward sloping input costs, would actually introduce a downward bias in your estimation. Now, the important thing is that if you were to do the math, assuming that these firms have constant return to scale and they live in a world in which they're CES, this statistic shouldn't be 0.22, it should be 0.88, which is like grossly rejected in data. Okay? So you should interpret that this statistic is rejected the bundled null hypothesis of constant return to scale plus CES. Okay? This is a low pass. Good. So now let me show you two research designs. One that is not going to work for what we need, which is going to be this one, and the second that is going to work for what we need, but this is important to build intuition. So you can write in the model in the same way that I did before, what is the shape of the marginal cost curve of the firm. So the shape of the marginal cost curve of the firm is going to depend on its own quantity, on aggregate marginal costs, and on aggregate quantities, and on the firm's supply shock that is received. Of course, this model is going to tell you that if you can find a variation in firm level quantities that is uncorrelated with supply shocks, then what you're going to estimate is this parameter 1 minus A over A, okay, which is going to be a transformation of the decreasing to scale parameter. This is going to tell you that if you run a regression of measure of marginal costs on changes in quantities, controlling for sector time fixed effects, and you find a demand shock for the firm. Now you don't want a supply shock, you want a demand shock that drives quantities, then you're going to estimate 1 minus A over A. The paper we show that what you can use is, given our production structure, you can compute this measure of marginal cost using changes in total cost minus changes in quantities. The drive between marginal cost and average cost is going to be a constant that is going to be differenced out when you control these differences. And our instrument is going to be changes in demand in the products that different firms sell. So imagine that you and I then are two different firms that are in the apparel industry, but you produce more shoes and I produce more jackets, and there is a change in the aggregate demand for shoes versus jackets. That is going to look like a relative demand shock for you versus me, and that is going to change your marginal cost. That is the variation that we're going to use. Now this is the estimate. We can do it excluding or including labor. We can use it with our measure of marginal cost or total cost. The results are quite consistent. So we measure a decreasing return to scale parameter of 0.84. So away from constant return to scale. Now, importantly, this number, 1 minus A over A, is not big omega. So in that sense, measuring this regression at the firm level is not what you want. It's not what you want because what you really care about is the elasticity of aggregate marginal cost with respect to aggregate quantities, not the elasticity of firm level marginal cost with respect to firm level quantities controlling for the aggregate. Okay, so what you really want to do is to run this regression at a more aggregated level. Okay, so in the paper we show that what you want to construct is a regression of marginal costs on quantities, and that is going to give you omega. Now, what is the aggregate level here? Well, it should be the aggregate level at which the market for inputs gets clear. And so in the paper, we do two things, and we show that they're quite consistent, which is either to say that the limits of these input markets are either at the district level, which would be like literally true if you only had labor, in which firms hire local labor in order to produce, or at the industry level, which is that firms are competing for inputs among firms in a given industry. When you transform these coefficients, what you would get is that when quantities go up by 1%, our estimates suggest that marginal cost increased by something like 0.6%.
Sorry, yeah. Can you treat Y as exogenous in the regression?
No, you need an instrument.
Yes.
And the instrument would be a change in demand that occurs for firms that either work in a particular sector or in a particular district, which is going to be the aggregated version of the correlations that we showed you. Exactly. Perfect. So if you put all these inputs together, you just like literally multiply them. What you get is a slope of the Phillips curve of 0.06, okay, at the quarterly horizon. Now we say that this is steep because if you were to compare it with estimates that we computed in this paper with Jeremy and John, this is like 1 order of magnitude higher than this. And if you try to benchmark it with something that uses methods that are the closest to ours, then you would go to this paper by Gagliardone, Gerler, Lensun, Tillens, and the upper limit of their confidence interval still 1/3 than ours, and their estimate is roughly like 1/10.
What prevents you to do the same calculation for the US?
Come again?
What prevents you to do the same calculation for the US?
Why
Why
can't you do this method for the US?
Yeah.
Well, you would need firm level data with prices, quantities, and inputs in the US.
At yearly frequency.
Yes. And that data for the US doesn't exist.
All right.
Yeah. Now, a different question is why is it that we don't do the methods in this paper for India in order to benchmark it? And for that, you would need measures of non-tradable price indices at the district level, and those also that exist.
Okay.
Sorry, the last paper is also the US, right?
No, this is Belgium.
And that's the last one.
Exactly. This is Belgium. Okay, good. So you can decompose this difference in, let's say, these numbers versus the point estimate in this interval or versus this number. And so if you were to use the frequency of price changes that in their meta-study, Maverick, Blackmon, Muller, and Stock report, then our estimated coefficient on the slope of the Phillips curve would be roughly 25% slope. So 1/4 of the differences come from the fact that prices in India are just more flexible than, for example, in this case for the US. But it's also true when you look at Belgium. Our number is something like 0.095, and their paper is 0.05. When you compute the effect of strategic complementarities, which is to compare our implied markup elasticity in our measures with respect to, for example, what Armitage, Cocky, and Konings measure for Belgium, then you're going to find that this implied markup elasticity is going to be very similar. Yes. So actually, the fact that you live in a world with Kimball demand, and that Kimball demand might be differently non-isoelastic between India and Belgium, that's not too important. Like the big elephant in the room is that we estimate a big omega that is just way higher than for other countries. Okay, so here the best estimate in our taste of this elasticity of marginal cost after changes in demand is this paper on convex supply curves by Boehm and Pandale-Najar, which estimate a number of 0.24 using data for the US. Our number is 3 times bigger. Okay. It's very similar if you compute something like, or even bigger if you look at the standard reference in this literature, which is this QJ paper in 1993 that estimates a number of 0.2, ours is like 0.7, 0.695. It is also larger than what you would get if you were to estimate in the context of a New Keynesian model and you did this IRF matching exercise, which Gutenberg and Woodford introduced, and Gagliardone, Kerler, Dentsu, and Tillens applied to value. They're also like substantially lower than average. So I think all in all the evidence suggests that the slope in the Phillips curve in India is way higher because Indian firms have less scalable production technology.
And this helps you in the growth literature, especially in India. There is a lot of evidence that for what you just said, it's not just return to scale. The fact that when firms are aging in India, they cannot expand.
Okay.
And the usual reason they give is that managerial span is not good enough.
Okay.
Or put on trust. I don't know.
That's fantastic.
So you see like the shape of the distribution of the size of firms is like cut.
Okay.
Like in the US, which is a bit like you think you want to expand, you cannot
Different.
because
Yeah. Okay.
that could better.
I'll ask you for drawings. That would be super helpful. Thank you. Great. So then there is the question of, okay, even if you believe our estimate at face value, okay, then there is the question of how important is changes in demand in the manufacturing sector in India to explain inflation in the manufacturing sector in India. That's something that the slope of the Phillips curve is like on its own not going to give you. So we go back and we take our measure of the output gap that I presented before. And I'm going to tell you, okay, let me just use that measure of the output gap that comes from a different source and plug in the slope of the Phillips curve that we estimated using this firm level data. Okay. And let me see how much of the published aggregate inflation number for the manufacturing sector can we explain. Okay. That's what this figure is showing. So the blue line is inflation in the manufacturing sector in India, and the pink line is the curve, is the fit of our estimation. Okay. And that, these things are on the IoT holder, but to me, that sounds pretty good. So this would tell you that, when you hear critics say that local demand in a developing economy are not important to explain local inflation, our estimates suggest that they're actually which I think is something cool. Okay, so cool. Great. So let me just say a couple of things that I think are important. So if you care about like the number for the Phillips curve, then our paper so far has told you that this Phillips curve is steep, its slope is larger than for a country like the US. That you can explain pretty well the dynamics of inflation using these aggregated exercise on price dynamics. But what I think is more interesting rather than the application to India is that we're giving you some research designs that if you had data on quantities and prices that local firms produce and of the inputs that they buy, you can apply to different settings, right? The same research design. As long as, I hate this part because I have to go back, but I'll do it. As long as this separability exists and you can express the Phillips curve in a way that aligns to the Galli-Gerlach decomposition and that is multiplicative in these three inputs, regardless of whether your economy means that different structural parameters enter into omega, you can just estimate omega. Regardless of whether you believe that you live in a world with Kimball demand that looks like Kleno-Willis or another alternative, as long as you can estimate this pass-through, then you're okay. Okay, so that in that way, misspecification is less of a problem. Now, if you live in a world in which, for example, you don't believe that the Calvo model is a good approximation, then you're into trouble because our model will take very seriously the setting of Calvo pricing. Let me move to there.
So given that your tech is maybe it's coming, but given that you're taking stock, how does the composition of what we learned so far give us information about the
So far,
action of business?
So far, nothing. Because here, what I gave you is keep the allocation constant and increase demand. What is the effect on inflation? That is the slope of the Phillips curve. Okay. The second input that you need is how the allocation is going to change, and that's what I'm going to explain. Good. So the issue
But
is that
that's where I need the decomposition. The decomposition is an interesting thing, but
I see. The decomposition for the slope.
yeah,
Yeah, you don't need that. You know, like I gave you a way to compute the slope of the Phillips curve. If you only care about that number, then multiply these three inputs and you're done. I think what is interesting about the decomposition is to understand a little bit better the mechanisms. So, for example, in my previous work on the slope of the Phillips curve, we say, well, the Phillips curve is flat. Well, why is that? Well, it could be because there is a lot of strategic complementarities. It could be because, at the margin, prices are very sticky. It could be because these firms are very scalable. We don't know. And if you were to apply this decomposition in a different country, then you would know the answer. And I think that is kind of like important. Yeah. Good. So now I'm going to tell you how these shifters affect inflation. Right? So when I say I'm going to tell you how, I'm going to tell you how we're approaching this problem because we're not done. Okay, so this is the second order different equations from these two endogenous shifters that I showed you. The changes in the curvature of demand and aggregate CFP. Now, they depend on aggregate demand as a function of two key elasticities, which is going to be the slope of TFP with respect to aggregate demand, which we're going to call capacity, and the slope of demand distortions with respect to aggregate demand, which we're going to call capacity. So we're going to try to estimate these changes. Now, when you look at the determination of these two elasticities, it really looks like a humongous monster. This is going to be a combination of covariances that are going to combine the elasticity of prices, the elasticity of quantities after cost. It's truly quite a disaster. So I'm going to tell you how we're going to estimate this, or we're estimating this, and why we want to highlight that it is important to do so. Okay, so let me just so this is the formula for capacity that I showed you, which is the elasticity of demand distortions after a change in aggregate demand. So the first component that you have entering into this elasticity is this first expectation, which is just going to be the average pass-through of prices after a changes in costs, which is something very similar to an object that we estimated before, which is you are going to, if you remember, it's going to be this number multiplied by this denominator. So once you have estimated this expectation times this number, and because you have also estimated alpha, if you're willing to take a little bit more structure and impose something for the discount factor, then you can just take our estimate and divide it by 1 minus beta alpha, 1 minus alpha, and you're done. So that's good. The second input that you need is this expectation of theta rho. So when you think about it, because theta rho is the price pass-through of an individual firm, then theta, which is the elasticity of demand, theta rho is only nothing else than the pass-through of quantities after a marginal cost. And so you can recover that by estimating a very similar research design that I showed you already, but substituting prices in the left-hand side by quantities. Then with respect to capacity, you have some coefficients that the first one is the quantity pass-through after a cost shock. And the second is going to be the differential quantity pass-through across different firms that have differential ex-ante distortions. And these ex-ante distortions are going to be the combinations of markups and input wedges, which is going to be different firms that have different TFPR. So to make the story short, you can compute this elasticity by using the law of iterated expectations and run a series of regressions of quantity pass-throughs across buckets of the TFPR distribution, and then accounting for the weight of different buckets. We haven't done this just because it's very involved. Yes. See, I'm going to finish like in 2, actually. So let me tell you, now that we're not done, why is it that this is like important to take into account? So the first 2 columns are our exercise of replicating the differential pass-throughs of prices after input shocks across the firm size distribution. This is very similar to what you find in the Amitis-Koki-Konings paper that Bakay Faris and Ghani use in order to inform the shape of their demand curve. And what you find is that larger firms have lower pass-throughs. Why is that important? Well, because larger firms tend to also charge relatively high. Large firms tend to charge lower markups. That's why they're large. So when they have lower pass-throughs, then more economic activity is going to come to them. Okay?
Sorry, you said larger firms?
So let me repeat that because I might have screwed up. So larger firms are going to have, on average, larger pass-throughs, smaller pass-throughs, and they're going to be larger. But they're compared to the flexible equilibrium, they're going to be too small. Okay? And so if you can reallocate economic activity towards them, then you're going to improve allocative efficiency. Okay? And because they have lower pass-throughs, after an increase in demand, they're going to increase their price less. So that means that the relative price is going to go down, and that means that they're going to expand. Okay, that is what happens when you compare firms that are small versus large. Now, in a world where you have not only differences in markups, but you have differences in input wedges, this is not the marker of heterogeneity that you would like to compute. You would like to compute something like TFPR, which is going to be the product of markups and input wedges. And when you do that same exercise in the data, you find that although different firms that have different sizes have statistically different pass-throughs, firms that have different TFPR do not. Okay? So the reallocative effects of monetary policy in an economy with input distortions, and in particular in ours, are going to look very different than if we misspecify the model and consider only an economy in which you only had demand distortions and we computed the differential pass-throughs. That's kind of like the idea. Now, the argument that I showed you before tells you that you shouldn't only compute these with respect to prices, but also quantities. And we haven't done that yet. We're doing it. Okay, so that's it. So our size results are consistent with Amitis-Koki-Konings, which again is the input that Bakay Faris are going to use in their paper. But the pass-through is actually statistically not different. It's not statistically different across firms with different TFPR, which is going to combine not only heterogeneity in markups, but heterogeneity in ex-ante combined wedges. And the important thing, like the qualitative message, is that you cannot make this proxy that differences in wedges are well approximated by differences in size in an economy in which you have two sources of distortion. Okay, so I don't like conclusions very much, so I'm just going to go very fast. I said what I told you. So this is a bottom-up approach of using microdata in order to estimate the pass-through prices and quantities, and then use a theory in order to aggregate them up into something that is the slope of the Phillips curve. What we showed you is that you can decompose this effect on inflation on two different components. What is the slope of the Phillips curve and how much the Phillips curve shifts after changes in demand? We show you that the slope of the Phillips curve is larger than what is estimated in other latitudes, and that you need to keep track of additional margins of heterogeneity in order to keep track of the allocative efficiency effects, but we're in the process of that. Okay, so what we're working on, this is very similar to what Ernesto was saying, is we need to add like more dimensions of heterogeneity. So what happens if you have heterogeneity in returns to scale, in price rigidity, in input usage, and so on. And study how that changes our understanding of the relative cost of inflation in this setting.
But there's only the dimension of heterogeneity. That's why I asked you about the decomposition. How important is the decomposition for the story? Because to me, those are going to affect the decomposition. But what really going to matter is going to be the total effect of this pass-through, then and the correlation of the pass-through with TFPR or some other characteristics.
Yeah.
Then it's not going to be informative about that.
Well, it depends. So one thing is how the slope of the Phillips curve changes when you have heterogeneity versus rigidity. That is one thing. The other thing is whether the covariance between flexible price pass-throughs and input wedges is going to be sufficient in a world in which you have heterogeneity in price rigidity, which is going to be about the effect of the shifting. Okay? So what I told you so far is that it doesn't really matter much when you have heterogeneity price rigidity in order to measure the slope, but that is not necessarily the case. We're working on it in order to understand where the allocative effects of monetary policy on the shift line. And those are two distinct objects that you can separate. That's what I mean.
Okay.
Or maybe I got lost in the monetary policy shock. Remember you mentioned like you were introducing.
So the cool thing about this framework, we think, is that because monetary policy in this class of models only affects first by affecting demand and demand affecting inflation, as opposed to something like changes in interest rates directly affecting inflation, which is something that would happen, for example, if you had like this cost channel of monetary policy. Then in order to estimate the slope of the Phillips curve, you don't need a measure. I mean, you could use it, but you don't need a measure of monetary policy shocks. All you need a measure of is a change that is exogenous on the output gap. So the monetary policy shock is one such variable. But you don't need to rely on the fact that you have a very good, well-measured source of random variation in monetary policy.
And even if there is like the archive, like the supply side of the policy shock, doesn't matter, no?
Well, this is similar to, I understand that. So the question is, you need a shock that moves the output gap. Right? Now, there are many demand shocks that move the output gap. One of them, and perhaps the most relevant one, is monetary policy shocks, because monetary policy shocks moves the output gap without moving the flexible rate of output. Right? But there are other demand shocks that, although they move the flexible rate of output, they move the output gap differentially, like, for example, government expenditures. So if all you cared was about the elasticity of inflation with respect to aggregate demand, then you could use changes to, for example, government expenditures. Now, if you care about also the first stage, which would be the effect of the shock on aggregate demand, then you need to be careful whether you're using monetary policy shocks or government expenditures, but we don't need to do that. Sí, diciendo andate, digamos, eso, porque no puede hacer una separación presional. Muchos de estos márgenes de heterogeneidad son problemas para detectar los signos.
Una cosa que no me quedó claro de la presentación, que no sé si será el objetivo, pero si me hablas de India, me acuerdo de y por lo tanto, en mi mente,
Non voglio personalità. Questa è la traduzione del source, questo è la